Morning, class. Today you're going to be reading about the search for early peoples. Now, I want you to follow along as I read for you here. Um, and I want you to be considering some of our key vocabulary because that's going to be on the assessment, as well as I want you to remember how did the Ice Age change the world that the first Americans lived in to allow them to come to America. And I want you to think about how did the environment change the way people lived. Now, let's begin at the introduction. Humans have always been on the move. From the earliest times until today, people have wandered the earth. Sometimes their journeys are fast-moving, exciting adventures. Other times their movements are so slow that they are hard to notice. It is in just this way, very, very slowly, that the early peoples first moved from place to place. Now, if you recall from our early conversations, the very first people, I'm going to zoom in here. Remember, the very first people, they arrived from Africa, and over millions of years, they traveled all across our entire Earth. Now, the very last continent that we believe they've made it to, other than Antarctica, was America, over the land bridge. At a number of times in its history, Earth has had long periods of freezing cold. During these periods, known as the Ice Ages, people who lived anywhere but near the equator shivered through long, hard winters. Life could not have been easy for those wintry times. Days, even weeks, were spent inside small shelters made of animal skins. Fires inside helped people keep warm, while icy winds blew outside. The weather was warmer during the short summers, but melting ice turned the frozen ground into fields of mud. I'm on paragraph 2. Paragraph 3. Many groups of people, however, still set out into these lands. During hundreds of years, during hundreds of thousands of years, their ancestors had traveled from Africa into Europe and Central and Southern Asia. Now some people in this great migration, keyword, or movement, turned northward toward the vast area of Asia today known as Siberia. These people, early peoples, did not travel alone. They followed such huge Ice Age animals that they hunted for food. One such animal was the mammoth, a giant hairy elephant. The hunters depended on these animals to survive. They ate the meat that was used and used the furs, skins, and bones to make clothing, shelters, and tools. You'll see a picture of a mammoth to the side of your page, which are now extinct animals. Turn the page. The last ice age started 2 million years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. At times it was so cold that huge sheets of ice called glaciers formed over much of the land. So much water was locked up in the glaciers that oceans became shallower. The Bering Strait, a narrow strip of water that today separates Siberia and Alaska, also became shallower. Over time, hundreds of miles of land that had been underwater were uncovered. This strip of land connected Asia and North America. The land bridge that joined the two continents is known as Beringia. Can you say Beringia? It's okay. Most scientists believe that the first humans to find Beringia were bands of hunters from northern Siberia. I'm a little bit low here. A band is a small group of people who work together to do activities. At that time, bands were probably made up of one or two families. Many bands probably crossed into northwestern Siberia and Beringia. They probably traveled only a few miles in an entire lifetime. Next column. Wanderers like these hunters who have no settled home, are called nomads. Finally, after thousands of years, the hunters reached what is today Alaska. But there, they and the animals they followed had to stop. Huge glaciers blocked their path. They could go no farther. So, the same ice age that had allowed them to come to America stopped them once they ran into those glaciers in Alaska. Now, I'm going to show you this on a map in a moment. But something happened years after that allowed them to go south into what we now consider the United States and the rest of America. Let's read about that. Then, about 12,000 years ago, the climate began changing. The earth warmed up. Over many years, some of the glaciers started to melt. The oceans began to rise, once again covering Beringia. At the same time, a narrow path opened between two melting glaciers. They covered what is now Canada. It was as if one door behind the hunters closed as another door in front of them opened. Animals followed the path between the glaciers. Hunters followed the animals, slowly making their way farther and farther into the Americas. These hunters became the first Americans. Now, this is all a theory. That means we don't know for sure if this actual pathway you see on the other page, across the land bridge Beringia, put your finger down there so you can see. We don't know if this is the one way that they went, but we know this is one of the ways because we found evidence or proof. Evidence is actual proof of something happening. So we know that somebody came along here because we found pieces of pottery or tools that they might have used to hunt. Now, after they got to Alaska, eventually, after the Ice Age, this area melted, and so for thousands of years they were able to move slowly through America until they got all the way down to South America, which is at the bottom of the page. Turn the page. How did they know this? Let's talk about what a theory is. New discoveries. If this theory or possible explanation about the land bridge is correct, the first people arrived in the Americas about 12,000 years ago. But could they have been here earlier? Many scientists today say yes. Once early peoples moved into the Americas, they settled all over both of the continents, in time reaching the southern tip of South America. Each native group developed its own culture or way of life. Some groups lived in cities, others were nomads who roamed the plains. Some made their clothing of furs and skins, while others made theirs of cotton. They lived in large wooden lodges, grass huts, tents made of animal skins, or steep cliff dwellings, which you guys have learned all about. They spoke thousands of different languages. So when we say Native Americans, we actually are talking about a huge group of totally different people. They were not alike. They all spoke different languages. They would walk up to each other, and if you were in a different tribe, they wouldn't even know how to speak to you. They spoke a totally different language. To build and develop such different cultures must have taken a great deal of time. Scientists now argue that it must have taken much longer than 12,000 years. But how could people have arrived earlier? It turns out the Beringia may have been uncovered at another time during the last ice age, from 45,000 to 75,000 years ago. Asian hunters could have crossed then into North America on dry land. It is also possible that the first Americans did not cross the land bridge at all. Instead, they could have traveled along the coast of Beringia to the Americas by boat, which we know the Pacific Northwest, they loved their boats. Scientists who study the cultures of people long ago are known as archaeologists. Can you say archaeologist? Good. In recent years, archaeologists have made discoveries that seem to support the early arrival theory. One of the most important was at a dig or archaeological site. Sorry, guys. Let me fix that. A dig or archaeological site in the sandstone cliffs of southwestern Pennsylvania. In these cliffs, archaeologists discovered an Ice Age campsite they called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. At the campsite, they found a number of artifacts or objects that early people had made. An artifact could be anything, guys, like an arrowhead or a weapon or any kind of tool. These artifacts are 14,000 to 15,000 years old. A few are more than 19,000 years old. Now, this is saying that people could have arrived much earlier than the last ice age, so maybe they came in the first ice age. There are other discoveries that support the early arrival theory. I'm on the next paragraph. In Monteverde, Chile, archaeologists have uncovered stone tools, wooden digging sticks, and animal bones that are 13,000 years old. And in Brazil, archaeologists have found stone chips that may have been made by early people. Some archaeologists believe that these artifacts are 30,000 years old. The number of artifacts that have been found is growing. Some archaeologists, though, are still not convinced that people arrived in the Americas any earlier than 12,000 years ago. They believe there is not enough evidence, there's that word again, or proof to support the early arrival theory. Some so-called artifacts, they say, are not artifacts at all. What one archaeologist believes is a stone tool that has been shaped by humans could really be a stone that was shaped by nature, or wind, or water. Archaeologists today continue to search for more evidence of the past. Each new discovery brings new information about the first Americans. This information helps archaeologists figure out what life might have been like long ago. Now, there's one final section on origin stories I would like you to read on your own. This is the kind of story that people in Native American cultures tell themselves about how did they get here, because they don't always agree with archaeology.